The first stone hit Clara Dutton across the cheekbone before she even saw it coming. She didn't scream. She turned her back to the crowd in one hard, swift motion and pulled 6-year-old Rose tight against her spine, every solid, unyielding pound of her planting between her daughter and that mob like a fortress built of flesh and bone and a mother's absolute will. "Keep your face against my back, baby," she said through her teeth. "Whatever you hear, whatever happens, you do not look up." Rose pressed her forehead into her mother's back and wept. Then the second stone came. Then the third. If this story already has you by the heart, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter of what happens next. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. Now, let's go back to Harrow Creek, Wyoming territory. The year is 1882. And a woman is about to be broken down to nothing in the middle of a dusty street, or so the town believes. Clara Dutton had been standing outside Dempsey's bakery for no more than 3 minutes when Frank Dempsey himself came through the front door with flour on his apron and a verdict already written across his face. "There she is." His voice carried the length of the street like he'd meant it to. "That's the woman." Clara felt Rose's fingers tighten around 2 of hers. She looked down at her daughter, 6 years old, dark eyes already reading the room. The way children learn to read rooms when safety has been uncertain for a long time. And then she looked back up at Frank Dempsey, and she held her ground. "Good morning, Mr. Dempsey," she said. "Don't you? Good morning, me?" He pointed at her, the gesture sharp and deliberate, the kind of pointing a man does when he wants other people to turn and look. "My wife's brooch, the silver one her mother left her. It went missing the same afternoon you came begging at our back door." "I came asking for work," Clara said. Her voice was even. She'd learned a long time ago that the moment a woman's voice shook, she'd already lost half the argument. "Your wife gave us bread. I was grateful for it. I did not touch a single thing that wasn't offered to me freely. My wife is a soft woman, too soft for her own good." He stepped down off the boardwalk, closing the distance between them in 3 deliberate steps. "And you took advantage of it." "I did no such thing. Everybody in this county knows what you've been doing since your husband passed." He said husband the way some men say accident, like it was something that had simply happened to her through no particular design. "Moving from one homestead to the next, taking what isn't yours, calling it charity when you're caught." "That is a lie," Clara said. He looked her over then, slowly, the particular kind of slow that had nothing to do with seeing and everything to do with making her feel seen wrong every inch of her assessed and found excessive and privately mocked. His mouth curved at one corner. "Is it?" he said. "Woman your size, and you expect people to believe there isn't enough in this world for you to eat without taking from others." From somewhere to her left, she heard a low sound move through the people who'd begun to drift closer. Not quite laughter. Worse than laughter. The sound of people deciding. "Mama!" Rose tugged at her hand. "Stay close to me," Clara said quietly. She didn't look down. If she looked down, she'd see Rose's face. And if she saw Rose's face right now, she wasn't sure she could keep her own steady. "I've seen her," a woman's voice cut in from across the street. "Lurking around my garden. Twice." "I walked past your garden," Clara said, turning toward the sound without moving her feet. "I was on a public road. Walking is not lurking." "You walked real slow." The crowd that had been passing was no longer passing. It had stopped, rearranged itself, grown a spine, and an opinion. A man she'd never seen before said something she couldn't fully catch, but she caught the word fat clearly enough, and she caught the word greedy, and she caught the laughter that chased both words down the street. "You want to say what I am?" Clara's voice dropped, instead of rising the way her father's had when he was holding something back that he didn't trust himself to release. "I'll tell you what I am. I'm a widow, 7 months. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I am doing every single thing within my power to keep us alive. That is what I am. You're welcome to look at me all you want. You won't find anything else." "You're a thief," Frank Dempsey said. "And this town's got no room for thieves." The first stone came from behind. She heard it before she felt it, the small, sharp sound of a rock leaving a hand, and then it struck her across the left shoulder, and the pain flared fast and bright, and she turned before she'd made the decision to turn, rotating on her heel, putting herself between the direction it had come from and Rose. Rose! Still low, still even. "Get all the way behind me." "Mama, they're all the way behind me, right now." Rose pressed herself against her mother's back, and Clara faced the crowd, and the crowd had grown in the past 3 minutes the way storms grow when conditions are right and nobody's paying attention to the sky. "Who threw that?" she said. Not one person answered. Another stone. This one caught her above the left eye, and the world went briefly white, and then red was running down into her vision, slow and warm, and she stood absolutely still, breathing through it. Because going down was not something she could let herself do. "Stop," she said. "There is a child here." "Send the child home," someone called back. "She doesn't need to watch her thieving mother get what's coming to her." "She has no home," Clara said. "Your neighbors made sure of that." She knew it was the wrong thing to say the instant it left her mouth. Not because it wasn't true, it was entirely true, but because truth has a particular way of making frightened certain people angrier. The crowd shifted, pressed inward. Clara turned again, keeping her back to them, keeping Rose against her spine, and she spread her arms slightly, not in surrender, in shielding, and she said to her daughter's hair so quietly, only Rose could hear it, "I need you to close your eyes and press your forehead right here, right against my back, and I need you to keep them closed." "I'm scared, Mama." "I know you are, sweetheart. So am I." She felt Rose obey, felt that small forehead press between her shoulder blades. "But I am not going to let anything happen to you. You understand me. I am right here. Right here." A rotten apple struck her in the side of the head. She didn't flinch. More laughter rippled through the crowd, looser now, emboldened by the fact that she wasn't fighting back, because a woman who didn't fight back was a woman who'd accepted what was being said about her, and acceptance was its own kind of permission. "Fat and useless," somebody called. "Curse on this town the day you showed up." Clara pressed her lips together and did not cry. She had decided 6 weeks ago, somewhere between an empty barn in Collins County and a church door in Millhaven that had been locked against her, that she was not going to cry where anyone could see her do it. Rose cried enough. It was Clara's job to be the thing that didn't break. Another stone, then another. Her hip, her knuckles when she raised her hand without thinking. And then she heard her daughter sob. Not the soft, frightened crying she'd been doing against Clara's back. Something different. Something that cracked all the way open. "Please!" Rose's voice tore across that street like cloth ripping. Clara felt the child pull away from her back and spin around, felt her small arm shoot upward, pointing at someone further down the road. "Please, mister, please save her. Please, somebody help my mama." The crowd went quiet, not all at once, in pieces, stone by stone, person by person, until the only sounds left were the wind and Rose's ragged, gasping sobs. Clara turned. A man had stopped in the street roughly 30 feet away. Broad through the shoulders, wearing a worn cotton shirt with the sleeves pushed back and work boots caked with the honest dirt of someone who'd been at it since before sunup. He had a quality of stillness about him, not the stillness of a man who'd frozen, but the stillness of a man moving very fast on the inside, thinking through what he intended to do. His eyes went to Rose first, then to Clara. He took in the blood running from her eye. He took in the way she was standing upright, chin level, not one single inch of apology in her posture, and he took in Rose's outstretched arm, still pointing at him, and something moved across his face that was there and gone before she could read it fully. His jaw set. He walked forward. The crowd didn't clear for him dramatically. It just moved the way water moves around something solid, because a man walking like that leaves people with very few options other than to get out of his way. Elias. Frank Dempsey's voice had a new note in it. The kind of note a man's voice gets when he suddenly remembers there are people whose opinion of him actually matters to him. "Elias, you don't know what this woman's done." "I know what I see," the man said. His voice was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. He stopped in front of Clara. Up close, she could see gray threading through his dark hair and the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into the western sun, and the way he looked at her directly, without any of the calculation or dismissal she'd grown accustomed to. Like she was simply a person in front of him, and he was simply a person looking. "You all right?" he said. It was such a plain, small question. Such a startlingly ordinary human thing to ask. Clara's throat closed around something she couldn't name. "I've been better," she said. Something almost became a smile on his face. Almost. He looked back at Frank Dempsey, and whatever lived in his expression at that moment made Dempsey take one deliberate step backward. "This is not how things get settled," the man said, and though he was speaking to the whole street, he didn't raise his voice to do it. "Accusations, evidence, due process. There's a sheriff in this town for a reason." He looked at the crowd steadily. "This is done." There was a silence that stretched until it became uncomfortable. Then, one by one, people found other directions to look in. The crowd's certainty, that living, breathing thing that had felt so solid 3 minutes ago, broke apart like it had never been anything but weather. The man crouched down, all the way down until he was level with Rose, who had stopped screaming and was now staring at him with streaming eyes and a face still crumpled from the force of everything she'd felt. "What's your name?" he asked her. His voice had completely changed. Still calm, but a different kind of calm. Patient. Like he had nowhere else to be. Rose sniffled. "Rose," she whispered. "That's a fine name, Rose." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a clean handkerchief and held it out to her. "My name's Elias. Your mama's hurt. I'd like to help her if she'll let me. That all right with you?" Rose looked up at Clara. Clara looked at the handkerchief, at the man holding it, at the crowd behind him that had gone shuffling and uncertain, at her daughter's face, which was still wet and still terrified and still underneath all of it, watching her mother for the signal about what to believe. She reached out and took the handkerchief. "Thank you," she said. Elias stood back up. "I've got a wagon," he said. "You and your girl ride with me. My ranch is 2 miles out. My niece Ada's there. She knows what to do with a cut like that. You eat, you rest, you figure out your next step when you're not standing in the middle of a street bleeding." "I'm not your responsibility," Clara said. "No." He agreed like that was a simple fact and not a refusal. "But you're bleeding and there's a child here." He said it the way a man says something when the arithmetic is clear and he sees no point in pretending otherwise. "Come on." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She'd learned hard things about accepting help from strangers, about the price that showed up later after kindness had made you comfortable and let your guard down, about the look a man's eyes got when he'd decided you owed him something. She did not see that look. She saw a man who was simply waiting, not impatiently, not with expectation, just waiting like the decision was entirely hers to make, and he respected that. "Rose," she said. "I want to go," Rose said immediately. "I know you do." Clara pressed the handkerchief to her eye. "All right," she said to Elias. 2 miles. He nodded once. No satisfaction in it, no performance. He turned, and the remaining crowd gave way, and Clara took Rose's hand, and they followed him to the wagon, and not one person left standing in that street said a single word. The road ran through open country, and the air smelled like dry grass, and the last warmth of the season bleeding out of the land before autumn took it for good. Rose sat between them on the bench, and within a 1/4 mile, she had drifted fully against Elias's arm, studying his profile with the relentless, unself-conscious attention that children haven't yet learned is considered rude. "Do you have a little girl?" she asked. "No," Elias said, watching the road. "I have a niece. She's 17. "That's not little." "It's not." "Our papa died," Rose said, with the plainness of a child reporting weather. 7 months ago. He had a fever." A muscle tightened in Elias's jaw. "I'm sorry." "Mama says he watches us from heaven." Rose tilted her head. "Do you think that's true?" Elias took a moment. I think there are worse things to believe, he said. Rose appeared to find this satisfactory. She leaned a little further into his arm. Mama, your eye is still bleeding, she said, turning. I know, sweetheart. Does it hurt? Some? A lot. Clara glanced down at her daughter and made a decision to simply be honest. Yes, she said. A lot. Rose reached across, found her mother's free hand, and held it carefully with both of hers. Clara looked out at the passing land and breathed through the throbbing in her face and let the child hold her hand and didn't try to make it into anything other than what it was. You don't have to explain anything, Elias said after a while. Not to me. I wasn't planning to, Clara said. All right. They rode in silence. Then, without quite meaning to, she heard her own voice. Henry's family said I brought the sickness into the house, she said. That I'd always been bad luck and the fever was proof of it. She paused. 2 weeks after the funeral they told us to go. Said the land was his by birthright, not mine by marriage. Were they right about the property? Legally? She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I don't know. I didn't know enough about what Henry had signed and what he hadn't. I was too busy with Rose and the household to pay attention to papers. She looked at her hands on her lap. I should have paid attention. You couldn't have known you'd need to. I needed to anyway. Elias drove without filling the silence, and she appreciated that. Appreciated being allowed to say a thing without having reassurance pushed back at her immediately. 7 months, she said. Barns when people will have us. Work when I can find it. I'm a good cook. I can sew. I know animals and I know crops, and I know how to stretch a pound of flour further than most people would believe. She paused. None of that matters much when people have already decided what you are before you say a word. What did they decide? He said. Same thing they always decide. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. That a woman my size alone with a child and no husband and no money must have done something to deserve it all. Rose had fallen asleep between them, her cheek warm against Clara's arm. You didn't take that brooch, Elias said. No. I know you didn't. Clara looked at him directly. How? He took his time with it, and she was glad he did. Glad he didn't reach for the first comfortable thing that came to hand. Because guilty people look hunted, he said finally. You don't look hunted. You look like someone who is extraordinarily tired of being wrongly accused. The Holt Ranch came into view with the sun tilting toward afternoon. A working ranch, practical and unadorned. A barn that needed paint fence posts set for function, rather than appearance tools, leaning against the house wall that someone had meant to put away and hadn't gotten to. It looked like a place where real work happened every single day, and something in Clara's chest eased slightly at the sight of it. A girl came out of the barn before the wagon had fully stopped. 17 or so, lean and sun-darkened with a practical braid, and a pair of eyes that took in the entire situation in about 4 seconds flat. Ada, Elias said. This is Clara Dutton and her daughter Rose. Mrs. Dutton's been hurt. She needs the cut kit and a meal. Ada looked at Clara's face. Directly, without flinching, without pity, without the particular careful politeness that was actually just another form of looking away. That needs proper cleaning, she said. Come inside. I'll get water on. I appreciate it, Clara said, easing herself down from the wagon, lifting Rose against her shoulder without waking her. I don't want to be any trouble. Ada glanced back at her with a look that suggested this was perhaps not the most useful thing Clara could have said. You're not trouble, she said, pulling the door open. You're a woman who got hit with rocks. That's a different thing entirely. She stood aside to let Clara through. Come in, Mrs. Dutton. Clara carried Rose across the threshold. The house was warm, the way working homes are warm, not from decoration, but from use. Something on the stove. The smell of coffee. A pair of worn boots by the door. Children's drawings pinned to one wall. Clara settled Rose down onto a narrow bench near the hearth without waking her, and then straightened up and stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides, unsure where to put herself. Sit, Ada said, setting a bowl of water on the table. Not unkindly, just directly. Please. Clara sat. Ada worked on the cut with quiet, focused efficiency. Close, but Clara needed 2 stitches, after all small, careful ones. She didn't apologize for the pain. She just said, "Brace yourself," and then did it cleanly, and Clara breathed through it and didn't make a sound. "Those people do this often?" Ada asked, blotting the area dry. "Not always stones," Clara said. "But something like it. Different towns, same conclusion." Ada rinsed her hands in the bowl. "My uncle won't leave it." Clara looked toward the door, where Elias had gone to unhitch the horse. "He doesn't need to take on what's mine to carry." "He doesn't think of it that way," Ada said. "He sees something wrong that he can set right, he sets it right. It's just how he's built." She dried her hands on a cloth. "Makes him hard to talk out of things sometimes." She almost smiled. "Fair warning." Clara almost smiled back. "There's a room at the back," Ada said. "Small. We can make it work for tonight. You and your girl sleep there." She looked at Clara evenly. "Tomorrow we figure out what comes next. Tonight you eat and you rest. That's all that's on the schedule." Clara looked at her for a long moment. The stitches in her brow felt clean and tight. Her hands had stopped shaking sometime in the last half hour without her noticing. Rose was breathing slowly and deeply on the bench, the loose, heavy breathing of a child who has frightened herself fully empty. She wanted to say no. She'd gotten practiced at saying no to kindness, because no was simpler, and kindness always came with a hidden clock. A countdown you couldn't see until it suddenly ran out and left you worse off than before. But her daughter was asleep with her cheek pressed against a stranger's bench cushion, and her face still faintly tracked with tears, and Clara was so tired that the tiredness had long since passed, feeling like tiredness, and started feeling like weather. "One night," she said. "Thank you." Ada nodded once. "Dinner in an hour." From outside she could hear Elias in the barn, the familiar sounds of a man doing the end-of-day work he'd done 1,000 times before. Clara laid her hand on Rose's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of her breathing beneath her palm. The child settled deeper into sleep. Clara stayed like that, her hand on her daughter's back, and outside the light turned gold, and the wind dropped, and Harrow Creek and all its stones seemed very far away. She didn't trust the feeling. She'd been fooled by peace before, fooled more than once, and she knew better than to reach for it too quickly. But for one moment in the warmth of this stranger's kitchen with her daughter breathing steady beneath her palm, she let herself stop bracing for the next blow. Just for one moment. It was the most rest she'd had in 7 months. Clara woke before dawn the way she always did. Not gradually, not with the slow surfacing of someone who had slept well, but all at once, eyes open, body already listening. 7 months of sleeping in places that weren't hers had trained her nervous system to come back online fast, to assess before she moved. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar. The blanket was heavier than anything she'd slept under in months. Rose was curled against her left side, one fist tucked under her chin, breathing in the deep, untroubled rhythm of a child who had decided somewhere between supper and sleep that this place was safe. Clara lay still and listened to the ranch wake up. The creak of the house settling, wind against the eaves. Then boots on the floorboards. Elias, from the weight and the direction, moving toward the kitchen, moving quietly, the way a man moves when he's been long accustomed to not waking anyone. She should stay where she was. That would be the sensible thing. She'd been given a room for the night, and she should use it, and nothing else, should keep her footprint small, should ask for nothing, and take up no more space than she'd already been given. She was good at making herself small. She'd had a great deal of practice. Instead, she eased herself out from under Rose's arm without waking her, found her dress and her boots in the dark, and went to the kitchen. Elias was at the window, with a cup of coffee, looking at nothing in particular, the way people do when they're thinking something through. He heard her coming and turned, and he didn't look surprised to see her. "Morning," he said. "I hope I'm not overstepping," she said. "You're not." He tilted his chin toward the stove. "Coffee's made." She poured herself a cup and stood at the counter, and they were quiet together for a moment, the easy quiet of two people who have no particular reason yet to fill the silence. "I'd like to earn our keep while we're here," Clara said. "I noticed the mending pile last night, and I can cook." Elias turned his cup in his hands. "You don't owe us work for a place to sleep, Mrs. Dutton." "I know I don't." She kept her voice even. "I'd like to do it anyway. I'm not built for sitting still with nothing useful in my hands, and I'd rather contribute than watch the clock." He looked at her with the same direct, unhurried quality she'd noticed in him the day before, that quality of actually looking, of not rushing past a person to get to his own conclusion about them. "Breakfast would be something," he said. "Ada does her best, but the results are unpredictable." Clara almost smiled. "What do you have?" "Eggs. Some bacon if you're generous with the definition. Flour." He thought about it. "Possibly cornmeal." She was already moving toward the larder. By the time Ada came downstairs, she stopped in the kitchen doorway and stood there for a full 3 seconds, taking in the scene: Clara at the stove, with her sleeves pushed up and her hair pinned back, the smell of biscuits rising from the oven, eggs properly set in the pan and not charred at the edges. "Lord," Ada said with feeling. "Sit down," Clara told her. "It'll be ready in 10 minutes. "I'm not going to argue with that." Ada dropped into a chair. "I burned porridge yesterday. I don't know how a person burns porridge, but I managed it." "You're distracted when you cook," Clara said, not unkindly. "I can tell because the heat marks on that pan are all over the place. You're thinking about something else, and then you remember what you're doing, and you overcorrect." Ada blinked at her. "That is accurate." "Cook slow and stay in the room," Clara said. "That fixes most of it." Rose appeared in the doorway, still creased from sleep, her hair going in 3 directions, hugging her doll to her chest. She looked at the kitchen, looked at her mother at the stove, looked at Ada, and then climbed into the chair next to Ada with the relaxed confidence of a child who has apparently decided the situation is acceptable. "I'm hungry," she announced. "Good morning to you, too," Ada said, looking like she was trying not to smile. "Good morning," Rose said seriously. "I'm still hungry, though." Elias came in from checking the stock just as Clara set the biscuits on the table, and he looked at the spread. The way a man looks at something he'd given up expecting, and sat down without a word, and poured himself a second coffee and passed the pot to Clara when she sat. It was the smallest gesture, so small it barely registered. He just passed the pot without being asked, the way you'd pass something to a person who belonged at the table. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup and breathed in the steam. "Mr. Holt," Rose said. She had already eaten 1 biscuit and was working on the logistics of a second. "Do you have any animals?" "Some cattle," he said. "A few horses. Some chickens Ada's been failing to keep organized." "I don't fail," Ada said. "They're just autonomous." "They got out into the vegetable patch again last Tuesday," Elias said to Clara, as if reporting a matter of public record. "They were exploring," Ada said. "Can I see the chickens?" Rose asked. "After breakfast," Clara said. "And after you put your hair in order," Ada added. "You've got a situation happening on that left side." Rose reached up, felt her own hair, and looked mildly appalled. It went like that. Back and forth across the table, ordinary and warm, the kind of breakfast that doesn't announce itself as anything significant, but that Clara felt in some deep and unguarded place as something she hadn't had in a very long time. After the dishes were done, Ada took Rose out to see the chickens, and Clara found the mending pile in the back room and sat down with it in the morning light. The work was simple: a torn seam in Elias's good shirt, a hem coming down on one of Ada's, a rip in a pair of work trousers that had been neglected long enough to become worse than it started. She had the whole pile sorted and half of it finished before noon. She added a small thing to the hem of Ada's shirt, without planning, to a simple line of reinforcing stitches that would keep it from pulling loose again for years. Nothing decorative, just sturdy. The kind of thing you did because you were good at it, and because good work deserved to last. Rose and Ada came back from the chickens with grass on their boots, and Ada explaining the difference between a broody hen and an ordinary one with more invested energy than the subject might have seemed to warrant. Rose was listening with her whole face, the way she listened to things she found genuinely important. "Mama," she said, stopping in front of Clara. "Ada says the brown one is mean." "The brown one is mean," Ada confirmed without apology. What does she do? Clara asked. Pecks anyone who looks at her eggs wrong. I have the scars. Chickens have personalities, Clara said. The mean ones usually have good reasons for being that way. Ada tilted her head at that and said nothing, but the look on her face suggested she was filing it away. Elias came in for the midday meal to find Clara had made soup from what was in the kitchen. Good proper soup, not the thin apologetic kind, but the substantial kind that actually did what soup was supposed to do. He sat down, tasted it, set his spoon down and said nothing for a moment. This is the best thing I've eaten since November, he said. It's June, Ada said. I know what I said. Clara kept her eyes on her bowl, but she felt something in her chest ease a little further. The afternoon was quiet, and she spent it helping Ada with the heavier laundry, the kind of work that needed two people and a full clothesline and actual muscle behind it. Ada worked without complaint and without conversation for the first part of it, but somewhere around the third line, she said, not looking at Clara. How old is Rose? 6, Clara said. She's good with animals, natural about it, not trying too hard. She grew up around them until the last 7 months. Clara pinned a shirt to the line. She used to follow Henry around the farm from the time she could walk. Henry was your husband? Yes. Ada passed her another shirt without being asked. How long were you married? 8 years. Clara smoothed the shirt on the line. He was a decent man. He wasn't... She paused, thinking about how to say it truly. He was better than some. I don't want to speak ill of him. He worked hard, and he didn't raise his hand to us, and he tried his best with what he had. But, Ada said carefully. Clara looked at the clothesline. I was never quite sure he saw me, the real version of me. I think he saw the idea of a wife, and I tried to fit inside it. She picked up the next piece. I was never particularly good at being small. Ada laughed, not unkindly. The quick, real laugh of someone who recognizes something. My uncle's not that way, she said after a moment. He sees people, all of them. Sometimes it makes things hard for him. She paused. The town hasn't always been easy on him either. After his wife Margaret died 3 years ago, people wanted him to... She seemed to choose her next words with care. They had ideas about what he should do next, who he should be. He's not particularly interested in what people think he should do. That's a useful quality, Clara said. It is. Ada glanced at her sideways. He brought you here because it was right. I want you to know that. He's not going to want anything back for it. Clara looked at the younger woman directly. I know, she said. And she found to her own surprise that she did. They had supper, all 4 of them again, as the light went amber and long, and Elias told Rose about the time one of the horses had gotten loose and ended up standing in the middle of the road, looking confused about its own choices, and Rose laughed until she had to put her fork down. The big, helpless, whole-body laugh of a child who has been in the vicinity of fear for so long that laughter, when it comes with everything behind it. Clara watched her daughter laugh and felt something shift inside her chest that she couldn't name precisely and didn't try to. After Rose was asleep, the 3 adults sat on the porch. Ada was mending tack. Elias was working on something with his hands in the lamplight. Clara had brought out the last of the mending pile, and her needle was moving through the fabric in the quiet, measured rhythm she'd had since she was 12 years old. It was Ada who said it without preamble, the way she tended to say things. Town's going to talk. Elias's hands didn't stop moving. Let them. I mean, they're already talking, Ada said. I went to the dry goods store this afternoon and Nora Dempsey was there, and she stopped talking the second she saw me and then said something very cheerful about the weather that I did not believe for 1 second. Nora Dempsey is Frank Dempsey's wife, Clara asked. His wife, yes. Also his primary distributor of information in this county. Ada set down the leather strap she'd been working on. Word's going to be all over Harrow Creek by morning that she's here. She has a name, Elias said quietly. She is here. Ada looked at him, then at Clara. Something in her expression settled. "Word's going to be all over Harrow Creek by morning that Clara's here," she said. "And there are people who are not going to like it." Clara's hands had stilled in the fabric. She'd been waiting for this. The point where the arithmetic of someone else's kindness ran up against the cost. It always came. She'd learned not to be surprised by it. "I should go," she said. Her voice was level. "In the morning, Rose and I should—" "No," Elias said. "Just that. No decoration. No qualification. Just the one word said the way a man says a thing he means." Clara looked at him. "Mr. Holt." "Elias. Elias." She kept her voice steady. "I am grateful for what you've done. More than I know how to say. But I'm not going to be the reason this family takes grief from their own town. I've had enough of being the reason people suffer." Elias set down what he'd been working on and looked at her directly. The lamplight put shadows along the line of his jaw. "Can I say something?" he said. "Go ahead. 7 months ago, I sat in that chair you're sitting in, and I was close to deciding there wasn't a whole lot left worth doing." He said it plainly without asking for anything back. "Ada can tell you. I was up before dawn every morning and working past dark every night, and doing it all because it needed doing, not because I could find any reason in it. Rose's laugh at supper tonight is the first time this porch has sounded like that in 3 years. He paused. "I'm not saying that to put weight on you. I'm saying it because you asked me why you should stay, and that is the honest answer." Clara looked at him for a long time. The needle was still in her hand. The fabric was half finished in her lap. "That's not a small thing to say," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted its weight. Ada was very focused on the leather strap in her hands. "The town," Clara said. "The town can be addressed," Elias said. "Rumors can be addressed. Frank Dempsey can be addressed. What I am not going to address is you and Rose walking back out on that road tomorrow morning." Clara looked down at the mending in her lap. Henry's family had used the word responsibility when they'd put her out. Used it to explain why the house had to revert, why the land belonged to blood, why her 7 years of work in that kitchen and that field and that yard counted for nothing against the arithmetic of inheritance. Responsibility as a door being closed. She'd heard that word weaponized enough times that it sometimes took her a moment to recognize it when someone used it to mean the opposite. 1 week, she said. "We stay 1 week. No promises after that, no assumptions. 1 week, and then we reassess." Elias nodded once. "Fair." Ada looked up from her tack. "I'll teach Rose how to properly organize the chickens," she said, as if this settled something. "The chickens don't need organizing," Elias said. "They need authority." "Which Rose clearly has," Ada said. "She told the brown one to move this afternoon, and it actually moved." Clara looked between them, and something that had been braced inside her for so long, she'd stopped feeling it, as bracing something rigid and old and permanently prepared for the next blow, loosened by one small degree. She picked up her needle. She went back to the mending, and inside the house, her daughter slept in a real bed for the second night in a row, breathing slow and deep, one fist curled against her chin, the way she'd slept when they'd had a home and a farm, and a life that looked like it would hold. Clara stitched through the last of the fabric and tied off the thread, and sat a moment longer on the porch before she went inside. She did not think about tomorrow. Tomorrow had a way of arriving whether she prepared for it or not. Tonight she let herself have the porch and the quiet and the lamp burning low between 3 people who were against all reasonable odds becoming something to each other. It was enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. The week passed the way good things sometimes do, faster than it should have, and with a quality of realness that Clara kept testing at the edges the way you press a bruise to confirm it's there. She cooked every morning before anyone else was fully awake. Not because it was required of her, not because she was trying to earn the roof over her head square meal by square meal, but because the kitchen in the early gray hour before the ranch came alive was the one place she'd found in 7 months where she knew exactly what she was doing and why. Her hands knew flour and heat, and the particular smell of biscuits just before they needed to come out of the oven. In a life that had become largely unrecognizable, the kitchen was still legible. Elias started coming downstairs earlier. She noticed, but she didn't remark on it. He would pour his coffee and stand at the counter, and they would talk or not talk, depending on the morning. And it was the not talking she found herself thinking about afterward, because it was the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from her, and she had forgotten that quiet could be that way. "You're going to run out of things to mend," he said one morning, nodding toward the basket she'd brought to the table. "I found a tear in the barn tarpaulin yesterday," she said. "I've got canvas thread in my kit." He looked at her over his cup. "You carry canvas thread. I carry everything that might be useful. It's a habit." She turned the shirt she was working on. "When you can't predict where you'll sleep, you get particular about what you put in the bag." He was quiet for a moment. "What else is in there?" "Needle and thread in 4 weights, a small knife, tallow candle, half a bar of soap." She paused. "A book of Psalms Rose chose herself. She doesn't read it, she just likes having it." "What psalm?" "She picked it because it has a picture of a lion on the cover." Clara kept her eyes on the stitching. She thought the lion looked determined. Something in Elias's face shifted that quality of almost smiling that she'd begun to recognize as the real version of how he expressed things. "Smart girl." "She is." Clara tied off a thread. "She's the best thing I've done. Possibly the best thing I'll ever do." "I doubt that," he said quietly. She looked up. He held her gaze for a moment, and then looked back at his coffee, and she went back to her stitching, and neither of them said anything further, and the morning went on. Rose had, by the end of the 3rd day, developed a complete and organized theory about every chicken on the property. She had renamed 2 of them over Ada's mild objection, renegotiated the brown hen's status from mean to misunderstood, and spent an entire afternoon explaining to Elias why the rooster was not a natural leader, but was doing his best in difficult circumstances. "She's going to be somebody," Ada said to Clara, watching Rose lecture the rooster through the fence rail with complete seriousness. "She already is somebody," Clara said. "You know what I mean." Ada leaned on the fence post. "The kind of person who walks into a room and the room reorganizes itself." Clara watched her daughter point firmly at the rooster and say something that appeared to be both instructive and encouraging. "She's always been that way. Even when things were bad, she'd find the one thing she could fix and fix it. She reorganized Henry's sock drawer when she was 4. He didn't ask her to. She just decided it was wrong and corrected it." Ada laughed. Then more quietly, "Does she ask about him much?" Her father. "She asks about him the way she asks about weather," Clara said. "Like it's a fact of the world. He was here and now he isn't, and she wants to understand the shape of that." She paused. "She doesn't grieve the way adults do. She grieves in small moments, and then she goes back to reorganizing the chickens." "Maybe that's healthier," Ada said. "Maybe," Clara agreed. "Or maybe it comes later. I'm watching for it." It was on the 5th day that the first shot landed. Not literal, but close enough that Clara felt it the same way. She had walked into town with Ada to pick up thread and salt and a few items from the dry goods store, because Ada had said it was fine, and Elias had said it was fine, and Clara had decided that hiding on the ranch was not a strategy she was willing to maintain indefinitely. She'd been hiding in one form or another for 7 months, and all it had produced was smaller and smaller spaces. She kept her chin level. She moved through the store without making herself either large or small, just present the way she'd learned to be present when a room was watching her. Nora Dempsey was there. Clara had never spoken to Nora Dempsey directly, but she knew the particular type of woman who had decided very early in life that her own standing depended on the careful management of other people's reputations. Nora was pleasant-faced, neatly dressed, and had the kind of smile that arrived slightly ahead of the actual feeling. "Miss Holt," she said to Ada warmly. Then her eyes moved to Clara. The smile didn't disappear exactly. It just suspended. "And Mrs. Dutton, is it I'd heard you were still in the area?" "That's right," Clara said. "Living out at the Holt place." Nora's tone was purely informational. Nothing in the delivery you could point to. "How convenient for you," We're grateful for their hospitality, Clara said. I imagine you are. Nora tilted her head. It's a lot to ask of a man, isn't it? A widow and a child, all that extra well. She smiled again. Elias has always had a generous heart, even when people take advantage of it. Clara set down the spool of thread she'd been examining and turned to face Nora Dempsey fully. Mrs. Dempsey, she said, I notice you haven't found your brooch yet. Nora blinked. The one that went missing. Clara continued, her voice pleasant and unhurried. The one your husband was certain I'd taken. I'm curious whether anyone has followed up on that. Whether there's been any actual investigation into where it went. She waited. Or whether it was more useful as a story than as a brooch. Nora's smile had gone entirely. A flush climbed up from her collar. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Clara said. I'm asking a direct question. Has anyone actually looked for it? The silence in the dry goods store was considerable. Ada was examining a bolt of fabric with focused attention and a barely contained expression. Nora gathered herself. Reverend Crane warned us. She said lower now, the pleasantness gone, and something harder underneath. He said you had a way of making decent people feel sorry for you. Said it was a kind of manipulation. Reverend Crane, Clara said, doesn't know me. He knows what you are. Then he knows more than I do, Clara said, because I've been trying to figure out what I am for 7 months, and I haven't landed on an answer yet. She picked up the thread again. If he solved it, I'd genuinely like to hear his reasoning. She turned back to the counter and finished her purchases and walked out of that store with Ada at her shoulder and her heartbeat perfectly level, which was not how she felt. But she had learned long ago that how you felt and how you presented yourself in a room full of people who were looking for a reason to decide about you were two separate decisions. Outside, Ada exhaled. That was something. Probably not wise, Clara said. Probably not. Ada agreed. But I enjoyed it. Don't enjoy it too much. Nora Dempsey is going to go directly from this store to someone's parlor. I know. Ada's jaw set. Let her. They were halfway back to the ranch when Clara heard the sound. She stopped, grabbed Ada's arm. What? Ada started. Listen. And then, Ada heard it too. A crash. Then silence. Then Rose's voice, high and sharp, the particular pitch of a child who is not hurt but who is witnessing something very wrong. They ran. The bull had come through the east fence. Clara registered this fact in about half a second. Registered the broken post, the churned earth, the trail of damage pointing toward the yard, and then she registered Rose. Rose was backed against the water trough on the far side of the yard, her doll clutched to her chest, her whole body rigid, staring at 2,000 pounds of frightened, furious animal that was pacing between her and any route to safety. The bull's hooves were churning the ground. His breath was coming in hard, angry gusts. Rose! Clara pitched her voice exactly right, low enough not to startle the bull, loud enough to carry. Do not move. Do not make a sound. Rose's eyes found her mother across the yard. The child was terrified, but she was also her mother's daughter, and she went absolutely still. Ada was already moving toward the barn. I'll get Elias. There isn't time, Clara said, because there wasn't. The bull had swung his massive head and fixed on Rose again that particular focusing of attention that came right before a charge, and Clara had grown up around cattle long enough to know the difference between an animal that was posturing and an animal that had made a decision. She looked around the yard in one fast sweep. A coil of rope on the fence post to her left. 20 feet of it, maybe 25. She grabbed it. Hey! She moved fast and direct straight into the bull's sight line, putting herself between him and Rose. Hey! Over here! The bull swung toward her. Up close, he was larger than anything she'd put herself in front of before. The sheer physics of him, the mass and heat and the particular wildness in his eyes registered somewhere below. Thought purely in the body, as a terror her bones understood better than her mind did. She swung the rope above her head and kept her feet. Come on then, she said. He charged. She moved left. Not gracefully, she had not been built for graceful, but she had been built for solid, and solid held when the bull's shoulder clipped the air where she'd been standing, and his momentum carried him past her. She used it. The moment he passed, she was already repositioning, already reading the geometry of the yard, already calculating where he would swing and where the gap would be. "Rose," she called, not looking at her daughter watching the bull turn. "When I say move, you run for the house, not the barn, the house. Mama, please. When I say move." Clara set her feet. The bull lowered his head. "Are you ready?" The bull charged again. Clara held her ground 3 beats longer than her instincts wanted her to, and then threw herself sideways and swung the rope, and it caught him across the face, and he reared back, shaking his head confused and wrong-footed. "Move, Rose, now." She heard small feet running. She did not watch. She kept her eyes on the bull and kept the rope moving and kept herself between him and the sound of her daughter getting to safety. Elias came out of nowhere, out of the barn, running hard, coming around the far side of the yard with his own rope, and the bull caught the motion and swung, and that was all Clara needed. She was already moving, driving him toward the east corral gate that Ada had somehow in the last 30 seconds gotten open. It took another minute, long and loud and full of churned earth and the bull's furious bellowing, and Clara's arms burning from the rope and her lungs pulling hard at the air. But the bull went through the gate because Clara gave him no other reasonable option, and Elias was there to pull it shut. In the sudden quiet, Clara stood in the middle of the yard and felt her legs decide they'd done enough. She didn't go down. She found the fence post and put her hand on it and breathed. Elias crossed the yard in 10 steps. He stopped in front of her and looked at her the way he had that first day in the street, the full, direct, unhurried look, and this time what was in his face was neither calculation nor pity. It was something else, something that hadn't had a name yet in the short time she'd known him, but that she was beginning to recognize. "You all right?" he said. Same question he'd asked in the street, same plain human simplicity of it. "My hands are going to hurt tomorrow," she said. He looked down at her hands. The rope had taken a toll. He reached out and took her right hand in both of his and turned it over and examined it with the careful, serious attention he gave to anything that needed understanding. Clara didn't pull it back. "Mama!" Rose crashed into her from the side, small arms around her waist, face pressed against her ribs. Clara's free hand came down on her daughter's back automatically, the instinct of 7 years of mothering, and she held her there. "I'm here," she said. "I've got you." "You ran at it," Rose said, her voice muffled against Clara's side. "You ran right at it." "It had a very small brain and a very predictable pattern," Clara said. "That helps." From behind them, Ada said, "3 people are watching from the road." Clara turned her head. There were, in fact, 4 people standing at the fence line along the road, too. She didn't know one she recognized as the man from the hardware store, and Frank Dempsey, who had apparently been passing at precisely the right moment to witness the entirety of what had just happened, or the wrong moment depending on how you measured it. Frank Dempsey was not smiling. He was not sneering. He was standing at the fence with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that Clara had never expected to see there, which was the expression of a man who has been certain about something for a long time, and has just been handed very inconvenient evidence to the contrary. Clara looked at him across the yard. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Elias turned and saw them. He said nothing either. He just looked level and steady, the way he looked at most things. It was the man from the hardware store who finally spoke. "Never seen anything like that," he said to no one in particular. "Never in my life." Frank Dempsey put his hat back on his head. He looked at Clara for a long moment, and something in his face moved, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way ice moves when the temperature finally changes. Slowly, with resistance, but moving. He turned and walked back toward town without a word. Ada came to stand beside Clara. She looked at the retreating figures, and then looked at the bull which had calmed down inside the corral and was now standing there, looking as if nothing had happened. "So," Ada said, "that's going to be a story in town by nightfall." Everything is a story in town by nightfall, Clara said. This one's different. Ada looked at her. This one has a different ending. Rose had pulled back far enough to look up at her mother. She had tear tracks drying on her face, but her eyes were bright and fierce the way they got when she had decided something firmly. I knew you would stop it, Rose said. I knew you would. Clara looked down at her daughter, at the absolute bone-deep certainty in that small face. The kind of trust that doesn't calculate odds or weigh outcomes, the kind that simply knows. She pulled Rose against her and held her close and felt Elias standing near her shoulder and the sun on her back and the solid ground under her feet, and she understood that something had shifted today that could not be shifted back. Not just in the road outside the fence line, where 4 people had watched a fat widow run at a charging bull and not break, but inside herself. In the place that had been bracing for so long it had forgotten it could do anything else. She had not broken. She had not even come close. Elias's hand came to rest briefly between her shoulder blades. One moment, then gone. But there. She took one long breath. Let it out. Let's go inside, she said. I'll start supper. The story that came back to them over the next 2 days was bigger than what had actually happened. Clara knew this because Ada went to town for flour on the second morning and came back with a full accounting of what was circulating through Harrow Creek's parlors and front porches and the space outside the barber shop where men stood and talked when they had opinions they wanted witnessed. According to the version Ada had collected, Clara had wrestled the bull to the ground with her bare hands. According to a second version, she had done it to protect not just Rose, but 3 other children who had been in the yard at the time. A third version, which Ada reported with barely contained amusement, had Elias arriving to find the whole thing already resolved, and Clara standing calmly in the yard with the rope over her shoulder like she did this sort of thing before breakfast. People need the story to be bigger than it was, Clara said. She was rolling out biscuit dough, and she did not look up. It makes them feel better about the fact that none of them were there. Some of them were there, Ada said. Frank Dempsey was there. Frank Dempsey hasn't said a word to me since. No, Ada agreed. But he hasn't said a word against you either. For Frank Dempsey, that is practically a formal apology. Elias came in from the East Field in time for the tail end of this conversation. He poured his coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at Clara in the way he'd been looking at her for the past 2 days, not differently than before exactly, but with something added to it, some additional layer of attention that she felt without being able to precisely describe. Reverend Crane has called a town meeting, he said. Clara's hands stilled on the dough for exactly 1 second. Then she went back to rolling. When? Ada asked. Sunday, after service. Elias kept his eyes on Clara. He's framed it as a community matter, moral welfare of the town. He means me, Clara said. He means you. She pressed the cutter into the dough, lifted a biscuit, set it on the pan. What does he want? I think he wants what men like Crane always want, Elias said, for everyone to agree with him before the evidence comes in. What evidence? Ada said. Elias was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding how much to say and in what order. Sheriff Colton came by yesterday afternoon while you were in the garden, he said. He's been looking into the theft complaints, all of them, not just the brooch. Clara set down the cutter and turned to face him fully. And he didn't give me details. He said he'd have something by Sunday. Elias held her gaze. He asked me to make sure you were at the meeting. The kitchen was quiet enough that Clara could hear Rose outside telling one of the horses something at length and with great conviction. He asked for me specifically, she said. Yes. That could mean 2 things. It could, Elias agreed. He didn't dress it up. She appreciated that. Clara turned back to the pan and set the last biscuit and slid it into the oven, and then she stood with her back to both of them and breathed for a moment and thought it through the way she thought through everything practically without flinching from the hard outcomes. All right, she said. Then we go. Ada looked at Elias. He looked at Ada. Some communication passed between them that Clara didn't catch entirely, but understood the shape of. "We all go," Ada said. Not a question. "We all go," Elias confirmed. Sunday came with a cold wind and a sky the color of old pewter. Clara dressed carefully. The blue dress mended and clean pressed, as well as she could manage without a proper iron. Her hair pinned back. She helped Rose with her braids and told her to keep hold of someone's hand and not to repeat anything she heard in the church, unless she'd thought about it first. "Why?" Rose asked. "Because words in public have a longer life than words at home," Clara said. "You want to be sure of what you're sending out." Rose considered this with the focused expression she used for information she intended to keep. "Like the rooster," she said. "He makes noise before he's thought it through and then everyone's upset." "Exactly like the rooster," Clara said. The church was already full when they arrived. Clara felt the shift in the room the moment she came through the door, the particular texture of a crowd that had been talking and had just stopped. Heads turned. Some faces were unreadable. Some were not. She walked down the center aisle. Her chin was level. Her shoulders were square. Every solid inch of her moved with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who has decided that the only thing worse than being looked at is letting the looking drive you to the back of the room. She took a seat near the front. Elias sat beside her, Ada on his other side, with Rose between them. Rose's small hand immediately finding Elias's and gripping it, because Rose had always had excellent instincts about who to hold on to. Reverend Silas Crane came to the pulpit. He was a tall man, thin in the way that suggested he'd always been thin, with deep-set eyes and the careful diction of someone who had studied how his voice landed on people and used that knowledge deliberately. "Friends," he said, "we gather today because this community has a responsibility to itself, to its character, to the moral foundations upon which decent people build their lives." His gaze traveled the room and arrived briefly at Clara. "There are forces that erode those foundations, slowly, quietly, often wearing the appearance of helplessness or need." A murmur moved through the crowd, not the agreeing kind, the uncertain kind. Frank Dempsey was sitting 3 rows back. Clara could see him from the corner of her eye. He had his hat on his knee, and he was looking at the floor, and he had the expression of a man who had made up his mind about something and wasn't entirely comfortable with the result. "Reverend." It was Elias who spoke. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't stand. He simply said it the way he said most things, quietly, with the complete confidence of someone who did not need volume to be heard. "Before you go further, I'd like to ask whether Sheriff Colton is going to be given the floor." Crane's jaw tightened. "This is not a legal proceeding, Mr. Holt." "No," Elias agreed. "But if we're going to discuss accusations against a specific person in a room full of her neighbors, I think the actual facts of the investigation might be relevant to the conversation." "I'll speak when there's something to say," came a voice from the back. Sheriff Ray Colton was a broad, unhurried man who moved through the world with the comfortable authority of someone who had been doing a difficult job for long enough to have stopped being impressed by theatrics. He walked to the front of the church and turned to face the room without particular ceremony, the way he might turn to face a cattle pen assessing methodical, already knowing what he intended to do. "I've been investigating the theft complaints in this county for the past 11 days, he said. "Every complaint filed in the last 4 months, the Dempsey brooch, the Harriman pocket watch, the 3 missing silver pieces from the Henderson house, the coin collection from the Watts barn." He paused. "All of it." The room was very still. "Every item was recovered yesterday morning," Colton said, "from a locked box under the floorboards of a cabin on the north edge of the county. Cabin belongs to a man named Luther Vane, who some of you know as a seasonal worker comes through every fall for the harvest." He let that sit for a moment. "Mr. Vane is currently in my custody. He has confessed in writing to all of the thefts." Another pause. "He also stated in writing that he was aware a woman in town had been blamed for some of the missing items, and that he had found this, his word, convenient." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the room had produced before. It had weight, It had the particular quality of a held breath that a large group of people release at the same moment. Clara sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was looking straight ahead at Colton, and her face was composed because she had given herself to composure as a discipline, but her heart was doing something complicated and fast inside her chest. Clara Dutton, Colton said, looking at her directly, had nothing to do with any of it. Crane tried. She had to give him that he tried. The woman's character remains a matter of concern regardless of. Reverend? It was Mary Watts who cut him off. She was sitting near the middle of the room, a compact woman in her 60s with gray braids, and the expression of someone who had been patient for slightly longer than patience actually warranted. My coin collection was among those items. My husband's grandfather brought those coins from Virginia in 1831. Her voice was steady and clear. I want to say something. Crane looked at her. I was in the dry goods store last Tuesday, Mary Watts said. I saw this woman face down Nora Dempsey's insinuations without raising her voice once. She turned and looked at Clara directly. And 2 days later, I heard what she did when that bull got loose and her child was in the yard. She looked back at the pulpit. I would like to know, Reverend, what exactly it is about her character that concerns you, because from where I'm sitting, it looks considerably better than some characters in this room that have never once been questioned. Frank Dempsey made a sound. Not quite a word. The sound of a man whose stomach has dropped. She made me feel foolish, he said. He was talking to no one in particular, or possibly to his own hat. I stood in that street and I said things. He stopped. Started again. My wife's brooch turned up in Vane's box with everything else. Nora found it this morning. He looked up and found Clara across the room. The rawness in his face was the realness of a man who had just been forced to look directly at something he'd been avoiding. Mrs. Dutton, I owe you an apology that I don't have good enough words for. Mr. Dempsey, Clara said. Her voice was even. I'd like my name cleared in this town. That's what I need from you. The words can be whatever you have. He nodded. It was a heavy nod, the kind that cost something. Rose, who had been sitting between Elias and Ada with the careful stillness of a child who has been told to listen and has taken this instruction absolutely to heart, leaned forward and looked down the pew at Clara. Mama, she said in a voice pitched just slightly below a whisper, but not entirely achieving it. Does this mean we're staying? Ada pressed her hand over her mouth. Elias looked at the ceiling briefly. Several people around them heard it, and the sound that moved through the room had the quality of genuine laughter, the kind that comes from somewhere real and doesn't perform itself. Clara looked at her daughter. At that small, open face with its complete and uncomplicated hope, looking at her the way Rose had always looked at her, like the answer to every question was located somewhere on her mother's face, and she just needed to find it. I don't know yet, sweetheart, Clara said. Let's get through the next 5 minutes first. But maybe, Rose pressed. Maybe, Clara said. Yes, maybe. Rose sat back, apparently satisfied. She folded her hands in her lap, in unconscious imitation of her mother, and looked at Reverend Crane with an expression of polite expectation, as if inviting him to proceed now that the important question had been addressed. Crane had lost the room. Clara could feel it, the particular shift in collective attention that happens when a crowd has decided when the story they'd been given has been replaced by a different one and the new one is sticking. He made one more attempt, something about the impropriety of a widow living in an unmarried man's house, and Elias said quietly without moving, Mrs. Dutton and her daughter are guests in my home. My niece is present. The circumstances are entirely appropriate, and this line of argument reflects poorly on the person making it. And the room agreed with the silence that followed in a way that made Crane look down at his pulpit. It was old Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had taught school in Harrow Creek for 31 years, and who had the authority that comes from having educated half the people in the room, who stood up and said what needed to be said. This community has wronged this woman, she said, publicly and badly. Some of us threw stones. Some of us watched while others threw them. Some of us said nothing when we might have. She looked around the room, unhurried, meeting eyes. I don't know what Mrs. Dutton intends to do. That is her business and hers alone. But what we intend to do, what kind of people we intend to be, that is our business, and I think we should be clear about it. She looked at Clara. I am sorry, Mrs. Dutton, for what was said to you, for what was done to you. You deserved none of it. Clara felt the thing she'd been holding braced since she walked into this building begin to release. Not all at once. In the same slow way it had been releasing degree by degree since the morning she'd woken up in a strange room and smelled coffee already made. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, she said. More voices came after that. Not everyone. Some pride truly does not bend. But enough, more than enough, that by the time the meeting dissolved and people began to move toward the doors, the shape of what had been decided was clear to everyone present. Outside in the wind, Frank Dempsey approached her with his hat in his hands again. He looked older out here in the open, away from the performance of the church. Just a man who'd made a bad choice and was now carrying it. My wife wants to know, he said, if you'd be willing to come to Sunday supper next week, both of you. He glanced at Rose, who was standing at Clara's side, examining him with frank and thorough curiosity. She makes a good roast, and she's been wanting to apologize in person. Clara looked at him for a moment. Not to make him wait, she wasn't built for cruelty, but because the question deserved consideration, rather than automatic response. That's kind, she said. I'll think on it, he nodded. Turned his hat once in his hands. For whatever it's worth, he said, what you did with that bull. My youngest boy was out walking on that road. He saw the whole thing. He paused. He talked about it for 2 days straight. Said he'd never seen a woman like you. Your boy sounds like a sensible person, Clara said. Something that was almost a smile crossed Frank Dempsey's face. He put his hat back on and walked toward his wagon, and Clara watched him go and felt Elias come to stand beside her, in the way he'd been doing lately, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. All right, he said. It was the third time he'd asked her that. Same question, different weight each time. She was beginning to understand that it was his way of checking whether she was still herself, still standing, still choosing to be here, and that it would never, coming from him, carry the faint impatience she'd learned to hear in that question from other people. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about 7 months of roads and barns and other people's charity with its hidden clocks. She thought about Rose in that street, with her arm outstretched and her small voice cracking open across the crowd. She thought about biscuits before dawn and the feel of a needle in her hands and a man who passed the coffee pot without being asked. Getting there, she said, and meant it. Elias nodded once. Rose slipped her hand into her mother's. Ada appeared at Elias's shoulder and said something dry about the rooster having been right about public opinion all along. And Clara laughed a real laugh, the sudden, unguarded kind, and Elias looked at her when she did, and didn't look away. They walked back to the wagon together, the four of them into the wind, toward home. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, in the way that follows something large. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of people who have been through something together and don't yet have words for all of it. Rose fell asleep against Clara's arm. Before they'd gone half a mile, the deep immediate sleep of a child whose body had decided the emergency was over, and rest was now the priority. Ada sat in the wagon bed watching the land go by. Elias drove with his eyes on the road and his hands easy on the reins. Clara sat with her daughter's weight warm against her side and watched the country open up around them and tried to locate herself inside this new version of things. She was good at adjusting to bad changes. She had spent 7 months becoming expert at it, at recalibrating quickly, at finding the floor of a new situation, and standing on it before she could think too hard about what she'd lost. She was less practiced at adjusting to good ones. Good changes had a way of making her nervous, because in her experience, they tended to be temporary, and the distance between temporary good and the next bad thing was always shorter than it looked. She was still thinking about that when Elias said, without looking at her, "You went very quiet." "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She considered how honest to be, then decided that honesty had served her better than caution in this particular house, and said, "About how long things last." He took that in without rushing past it. What things? Good things, she said. I've gotten careful about them, about letting myself count on them. The wagon went over a rut, and Rose stirred and settled without waking. Elias waited until they were rolling smooth again before he answered. That's a reasonable thing to be, he said, given what you've been through. It's also exhausting, she said. Waiting for the end of something before you've let yourself have the middle of it. He glanced at her then. Not long his eyes went back to the road, but she caught it. Then maybe, he said carefully, you could try just having the middle for a while. See what that's like. Clara looked at Rose's sleeping face, at the loose, trusting weight of her against her side. Maybe, she said. And this time when she said it, it felt like less of a hedge and more of a door. The week that followed the town meeting moved differently than any week Clara had experienced in recent memory. Not because dramatic things happened, they didn't mostly, but because of the accumulation of small things, the way small things have of becoming the actual texture of a life, when you stop waiting for the large thing to arrive and cancel them all out. Nora Dempsey came to the ranch on Tuesday. She came without Frank, which Clara understood to mean she'd decided her apology was her own business and didn't need a husband to deliver it for her. She stood on the porch with the Dempsey brooch in her hand, the silver one with the small blue stone that had started all of this, and she held it out to Clara. I want you to have it, she said. Clara looked at the brooch. Mrs. Dempsey, that was your mother's. I know what it was. Nora's voice had none of the careful pleasantness Clara had heard in the dry goods store. It was rougher than that. Realer. I know exactly what it was, and I know what I did with my suspicions, and I know what those suspicions cost you. She pressed the brooch forward. Please, I need to do something that means something. Clara took the brooch. Not because she wanted it. She wasn't sure she did, but because refusing it would have taken something from Nora Dempsey that she needed to give. Thank you, Clara said. Nora looked at her with the expression of a woman who has prepared for a conversation and arrived to find it was shorter and kinder than she'd braced for. I heard about the bull, she said. Most people did. Bleh. Frank didn't sleep right for 2 nights after he saw it. Nora looked at her hands. He kept saying he'd called you greedy. In the street. She looked up. He's not a cruel man. He was scared, and he was wrong, and he made it someone else's fault. That's not the same as cruel. But it's not nothing either. No, Clara agreed. It's not nothing. Nora nodded. She looked at the door, then back at Clara. My girl is 8 years old, she said. I want her to grow up in a town where women are... She stopped. Where it's different than it was last month. Clara looked at her steadily. Then make it different, she said. You have more influence in this town than you know Mrs. Dempsey. I've seen how people listen when you talk. Use it better than you did before. That's all any of us can do. Nora Dempsey left 20 minutes later with straighter shoulders than she'd arrived with. Ada watched her wagon go from the kitchen window and said, That was generous, what you said to her. It was practical, Clara said. A reformed gossip who feels she has a purpose is more useful than a shamed one who has nothing to do with her energy. Ada looked at her with the expression she sometimes got, the one that meant she was reassessing something. Has anyone told you lately that you're quite something? Not in those words, Clara said. Well, Ada said, and went back to the beans she was sorting, and that was that. Old Mrs. Henderson came by on Thursday with 2 jars of preserved peaches and an offer. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands folded and her back straight, with the efficiency of a woman who had 30 years of making herself understood to people who didn't always want to listen. I need help with the younger children, she said. The school has grown past what one person can manage. I have 12 children under the age of 9 and 6 older ones, and I cannot give the younger ones what they need while I'm working with the older ones. She looked at Clara. I've watched you with Rose. I've watched the way you explain things. You have a teacher's patience and a farmer's practicality, which is exactly the combination those children need. She paused. I can't pay much, but I can pay something. Clara sat very still. You're offering me work." "I'm offering you a position," Mrs. Henderson said. "There's a difference. Work is what you do when someone needs a hand. A position is something that belongs to you." Clara thought about the 7 months, about barns and back doors and work offered and retracted, and the way charity curdles when it's given too long without being transformed into something mutual. She thought about standing in a kitchen that was starting to feel like her kitchen, and a child who was starting to sleep the way she used to sleep before everything went wrong. She thought about what it would mean to have a thing that was hers. "When would you need me to start?" she said. Mrs. Henderson allowed herself a small, satisfied expression. "Monday." After she'd gone, Clara stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went outside to where Rose was in the yard, absorbed in some elaborate game involving 3 chickens and what appeared to be a small court of justice. "Rose," she said. Rose looked up. She read her mother's face the way she always had, with the quick instinctive accuracy of a child who has learned that her mother's expressions carry information worth knowing. "Good news," she said. "I think so," Clara said. "I have a job, a real one, teaching with Mrs. Henderson." Rose stood up, shedding chickens. "At the school." "At the school." Rose processed this for approximately 2 seconds. "Can I come?" "You already go to school." "I know, but—" Rose tilted her head. "It's different if you're there." Clara crouched down so they were level, which she didn't do often enough, and which always made Rose go slightly more still, like she recognized this as a signal that what was being said mattered. "It's going to be different here," Clara said. "All of it. But I need you to understand that different doesn't mean uncertain. I know things have been for a long time. Things have been very uncertain." "I know," Rose said. "I need you to know that I'm working on making them not be that way anymore." Clara held her daughter's gaze. "This is a good place. These are good people." "I know that too," Rose said. She said it with the simple, uncluttered certainty she'd been carrying since the first morning she woke up in this house and decided it was safe. "I knew it before you did, Mama." "You did?" Clara admitted. Rose nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been formally confirmed. Then she turned back to her chickens, because the court of justice apparently could not adjourn indefinitely. Clara stayed crouched in the yard for a moment, watching her daughter move through the world with that particular assurance she'd been born with and that 7 months of hard living hadn't managed to touch, and felt something in her chest that she'd been waiting to feel for long enough that she almost didn't recognize it when it arrived. It was gratitude. Not the anxious, indebted kind, not the kind that came with a clock on it, but the plain, open kind that simply acknowledged that she was alive, and her daughter was alive, and they were here in this yard, in this light, with a future that had actual shape to it. She let herself feel it, all the way through. That evening, Elias asked her to walk with him. He asked it simply after supper, the way he asked most things, not with build-up or ceremony, just standing at the door with his hat in his hand and the last of the day's light still in the sky. Ada gave no indication of having noticed. Rose was already asleep. Clara dried her hands on the dishcloth and said yes. They walked out past the barn and along the fence line where the cattle moved slow and dark against the evening. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes, and it was the same good quiet she'd come to associate with him specifically, the quiet of someone who had things to say and was taking his time with them, because he'd learned that saying them right mattered more than saying them fast. "I want to ask you something," he said finally. "Go ahead." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. Out past the fence, the land went wide and dark and open in every direction, the kind of landscape that makes a person feel both small and strangely more themselves. "I want to ask whether you're planning to stay," he said. "Not as a guest. Not as someone Mrs. Henderson employs who happens to have her meals here." He held her gaze. "As someone who—" He paused, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to be finding the words genuinely difficult, which she found she trusted more than easy words would have given her cause to. "As someone who belongs here, if you want to." Clara looked at him. At the man who had walked toward her across a hostile street because his sense of what was right was stronger than his interest in what was easy. Who had passed the coffee pot without being asked? Who had held her hand in that church pew with the steadiness of someone who had decided and wasn't going to undecide? Who had asked her twice whether she was all right and meant it both times, and who was asking her now quietly in the last of the evening light whether she wanted to stop moving? What would that look like? She said, because she was a practical woman, and practical women asked practical questions even when their hearts were already leaning in a direction. It would look like what it's been looking like, he said, and more of it. And eventually, he paused again. Eventually, whatever you're ready for. I'm not in a hurry. I've got the one thing I know for certain. He looked at her steadily. I don't want you to leave. Clara thought about the road. She thought about it deliberately, the way you look at something one last time before you put it down, the 7 months of it, the barns and the cold and the weight of Rose against her back while stones came out of the dark. She thought about what she'd carried on that road and what it had cost her and what it had quietly made of her. She thought about the fact that she had run at a 2,000-pound bull and not broken, that she had stood in a church full of people who had wronged her and held her ground and held her dignity simultaneously, that she had taken a mending pile and a larder of modest ingredients and a household that was functioning but not thriving and made it into something more because that was what she knew how to do. She knew how to take what was there and make it into more than it had been. She looked at Elias. I'm not in a hurry either, she said, but I'd like to stop moving. If this is where I can stop. It is, he said, simply, completely. She nodded once. He nodded once. And they stood there in the dark of the yard under the wide Wyoming sky, while the cattle moved slow behind the fence, and somewhere in the house, Rose slept without listening for danger, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to begin was beginning. They walked back to the house together. The lamp was still burning in the kitchen window, the warm, ordinary light of a home that expected people to come back to it. Clara thought about the woman who had stood in that street 4 weeks ago with blood on her face and her daughter's arms around her waist, and nothing left. No roof, no name, no reason to believe the next day would be different from the last. That woman had been standing in the ruins of everything she'd built and lost, and had still in the middle of it refused to let her daughter feel her break, had turned her back to the crowd and made herself a wall. She had not known standing there that the wall was also a beginning. She did not believe that suffering had been necessary. She did not believe it had been deserved or instructive or part of some design. She believed it had simply happened the way hard things happen, without meaning, without plan, and that the meaning came afterward in what you did with what you were left holding. What she'd been left holding was her daughter and her capability, and a refusal so bone deep it had never once felt like courage because it had never felt like a choice. What she'd found on the other side of it was a ranch in Wyoming, and a man with a quiet voice, and a 17-year-old girl who burned porridge, and a kitchen that smelled like coffee before the sun came up, and a town that had done her wrong and was slowly, imperfectly trying to do better. It was not the life she had planned. It was larger than the life she had planned, and stranger and harder won, and it was hers. She stepped up onto the porch and pushed the door open, and the warmth of the kitchen came out to meet her. Behind her, Elias's boots on the steps, the door closing, the lamp on the table. Clara Dutton, widow, mother woman who had been thrown into the road and had gotten up from it, stood in the kitchen of her home and knew with the same bone-deep certainty that had carried her through everything that had tried to stop her that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not survived 7 months on the road by being fragile, and she would not waste what those months had made of her by being small in the life that waited on the other side of them. She was here. Rose was here. And for the first time since the fever took Henry, and the road took everything else, the future was not something to brace against. It was something to walk into. And Clara Dutton, who had never once in her life stopped walking, took the next step without flinching. She was home. She had found it the hard way, the only way she'd ever known how to find anything worth keeping, by refusing through everything to stop.